On today's agenda, we're going to be talking about food addiction. So we're going to go through a quiz to help you identify if you might have a problem with food addiction. We're going to talk about the science behind food addiction, and then we're going to go through some steps to help you break the cycle of food addiction. Okay, so like Eva said, we're going to start off real quick with a pop quiz. If possible, go ahead and grab a piece of paper and pen just to write down your answers or do your best to track them in your head. After the quiz, just so you know, we will be asking you how many times you answered options 3 or 4. So for the following statements, just please use these numerical options. You can use 0 if you never do this, 1 if you do this once per month, 2 if you do this 2 to 4 times per month, 3 if you do this 2 to 3 times per week, or 4 if you do this 4 or more times per week. So for the first statement, it's I find myself consuming certain foods even when I am no longer hungry. Number 2, I worry about cutting down on certain foods. And number 3, I feel sluggish or fatigued from overeating. Number 4, I spend time dealing with negative feelings from overeating certain foods instead of sharing time with family or friends, working, or doing other important or recreational activities. And number 5, I have had physical withdrawal symptoms such as agitation and anxiety when I cut down on certain foods, but this does not include caffeinated drinks. Number 6, my behavior with respect to food and eating causes me significant distress. And number 7, issues related to food and eating decrease my ability to function effectively in your daily routine, job or school, social or family activities, or health difficulties. For the last 2 questions, you can just simply answer yes or no. So for number 8, I keep consuming the same types of or amounts of food despite significant emotional and or physical problems related to my eating. And number 9, eating the same amount of food does not reduce negative emotions or increase pleasurable feelings the way it used to. So now for scoring, if you answered yes to either questions 8 or 9 or both, and answered options 3 or 4 on at least 3 of the first 7 questions, you do meet the food addict criteria. All right, so now that maybe you guys have seen that if you might have any issues or anything like that, let's talk a little bit about the science behind why you might crave and get enough of certain foods. There is actual evidence that people do become addicted to food. I'm going to reference an article in the October 2012 ACE Idea Fitness Journal for today's purposes, but there are additional studies out there that support the theory that there is a link between food and addiction, much the same way there is between drugs and addiction. The main theories about food addiction are based around the role of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter that works with our brain's reward system. Basically what it does is it signals when we are getting rewards, and it makes us want more of those rewards. Now, for example, cocaine and heroin hijack this reward system, and so do appetite-controlling hormones. So one question is, do overweight or obese people have something different with their reward centers in their brains that make them crave food more so? It seems this might be the case. Researchers have found that obese people do have fewer dopamine receptors in the reward center of their brain, which makes them have to eat more to experience that same reward or high we get when we eat food. It also looks like obese people are affected by both nature and nurture when it comes to the number of dopamine receptors. They tend to have fewer to begin with, but they also cause the downregulation of the ones they do have by eating what are termed hyperpalatable foods, or calorie-dense foods that typically have more sugar and fat. What I mean by downregulation is that when we continually flood our brains with dopamine by eating these hyperpalatable foods, our body lowers the amount of the receptors for that dopamine, which makes it necessary to eat more of these foods to get the same level of reward. So basically, a vicious cycle is formed. You eat more food, you get less receptors, you have an increased appetite, so you eat more food, and you have less receptors, you get the picture. The same study that looked at these dopamine receptors also found that people who had less receptors had less activity in their prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that deals with planning, organizing, controlling irritability, as well as impatience, making choices, and impulsivity, the last 3 being the most relevant here. So we've got another added problem. Not only do people have to eat more and more food to get the same feeling of pleasure, it's also harder to stop after eating that first bite due to less activity in that brain region that controls impulsivity and making choices. As quoted in the article, this is why stressing moderation to a food addict is a moot point. I do believe this quote is a little bit extreme, but it is worth noting that if you believe you have a food addiction, or if you scored low on Stacy's quiz, you might need to be very careful when telling yourself, oh, I'll have just one. Now let's step back for a second and talk about those hyperpalatable foods. Like I said, they are foods that typically have more sugar and fat in them. Researchers have found that diets that have more hyperpalatable foods, especially sweet foods, are more rewarding to the brain and can be potentially more addictive than cocaine or heroin. That's pretty serious stuff, in my opinion. Withdrawal is the same way. In fact, they found that foods that have salt, fat, and sweet flavors use more neural pathways in your brain, making the adaptations more difficult to change than possibly cocaine or alcohol, because almost all the dopamine neurons are activated with food cues. More difficult to change than alcohol or nicotine. Again, very serious stuff we're talking about here. And so why do our bodies crave these hyperpalatable and consequently calorie-dense foods in the first place? Why don't we crave carrots and apples? Well, hundreds of years ago, we didn't have guaranteed food on the table. Our body didn't know when or where that next meal would come, so it craved foods that had the most energy, filling our body as full as it could to help it survive. Now, unfortunately, our genes have not adapted to the world of today when there's food available everywhere we turn. And the foods that are most calorie-dense these days are typically the ones that are the worst for us. Another interesting study came from the Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis about the role of addictive genes passed down in families. They did a study in the early 1990s and found that people were just as likely to be obese whether or not they came from a family that had addictive genes in their DNA. But the interesting thing is when they did a follow-up study in 2001 to 2002, they found that all of a sudden people were 30 to 40% more likely to be obese if they had addiction genes in their family. And for women, it was 50% greater. So what happened in those 10 years that could have changed things? Well, we know that genes do not change that quickly. So what happened was that our environment changed that causes addictive genes to switch on. The study of this is called epigenetics. Basically, we know that environmental cues, whether they be people, places, or things, can influence how our genes are expressed. Which ones are turned on, which ones are turned off. So if you live in a community that has a farmer's market, a bike path, and you have a lot of friends who use those things, the genes that control your weight operate like they should, and you can more easily work towards having a healthier life. But there are also negative things out there that can cause these same genes to be expressed in that negative way, to turn on some of the addiction genes, turn off some of the good ones. An example they give in the ACE article is, say you start out your day in a hurry, you get up late, you have to rush to get ready for work, you skip breakfast, you have an argument with your spouse, and you put your body into that fight or flight response, which is your body's natural reaction to stress that goes way back to those days when there was little food available and when there were daily threats to your life by things like wild animals. So what happens is your body senses danger and releases all sorts of hormones to help you fight or run away from these dangers. These hormones that were released trigger fat storage and cravings because that's what your body thinks it needs to survive. And then you decide to reach for that candy bar to deal with your stress because it craves those types of foods, the calorie-dense, the fat, the sugar. Your body does not actually use all those hormones that were released when you got to have that fight or flight response because you do not actually run away or fight anything. So the hormones continue to circulate in your body, causing you to store fat, causing you to crave more food. This daily stress and consequently this need for more hyperpalatable foods to help deal with the stress changes your brain structure and in turn causes weight gain, takes a toll on how those genes are expressed. The genes that were once expressed normally now support the overeating and addiction, further worsening that situation. Now, people that study epigenetics do believe that we can reverse this message and help express our genes in the right way, turning off those addiction genes if we are born with them. Then the question becomes, how do we go about reversing this vicious cycle? Eva's going to go over some ways that we can start to turn things around. So many times we're not even aware that we are trapped in an addictive cycle with our foods, and it's impossibly hard to break the addiction if you don't even recognize that you have a problem. If you feel like some of the questions from the quiz or some of the things that Shelby's talked about applies to you, then some of these actionable steps might help you to make a change. But before we get into those steps, I want to let you know that there are varied schools of thought on how to break food addiction. The first says that complete abstinence and a cold turkey approach is the only way to beat food addiction. The other says that you should make small changes over time to overcome the problem. As we talk through the different approaches, try and key into what you feel might work best for you. As we all know, health and wellness isn't a one-size-fits-all. It's important to tailor these ideas to your own individual needs. So the abstinence approach. Just as with any other drug, some people with severe food addictions cannot afford even a taste of their trigger foods because it leads to stronger, more intense cravings and an eventual binge. And this gets tricky. You can try and evaluate on your own what approach will work for you. In the complete abstinence approach, you're making the decision to never ever eat those trigger foods again. Some people feel that this is the only way to keep the addiction under control. If you're on the fence about this, it can help to weigh out the pros and cons of the changes. Will I feel better? Will I look better? Will my risk for diabetes be lower? Some cons might include that there are no more family brunches with French toast. You can't have ice cream and cake for birthdays. So it can be tough for people, but for some, it really is better with this approach. Some people just can't have their trigger foods in moderation, and by pretending they can, the addiction remains as strong as ever. Other experts insist that to make a lasting, realistic change, complete and total abstinence just isn't ideal. They suggest that you gradually make changes. They say you should definitely not go cold turkey or completely banish a food because that can make the cravings even stronger. Instead, if you can try to start to set parameters and reasonable portion standards around your trigger foods, that can be a way to incorporate them into your life but without extreme binges. Create rules around those foods and set them only for special occasions. This approach is a lot more flexible, and instead of becoming obsessed with not eating those foods, you can tell yourself that eventually you can have them again if you want one. With either approach, though, if you slip, start over. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill. If you feel like you've slipped up, you have an opportunity the next time and the next day to make a better choice. So some of the areas that are agreed upon as far as controlling or overcoming your food addiction include identifying triggers. So explore what foods make you feel out of control. For many people, the processed starchy carbs that are so prevalent in our society are the most commonly addictive foods. However, it's not unheard of to have an addiction to a relatively healthy food that in unhealthy amounts becomes harmful. Things like nuts or nut butters come to mind here. Next, you want to remove those triggers. Distance yourself from the foods that you crave and that inevitably you tend to lose control over. If cookies are your downfall, don't purchase them, don't bake them, and just don't allow them in your house. As you identify those trigger foods, also start to identify the situations in which you tend to overeat. Is it at home alone? Do you tend to overeat at social gatherings? Doing this will help you to begin the next step of overcoming your food addiction. Just as I talked about removing the trigger foods from your home, you want to ensure that other locations are safe for you as well. Just like a drug addict needs to avoid their old neighborhood, you must try to distance yourself from the places that put you close to your trigger foods. Keep yourself out of the bakery department when grocery shopping. If you feel comfortable enough, let the people that you're close to know about the change you're making so that they can help you. If you have a friend who offers food to you a lot, make sure that friend knows that while you appreciate the kindness, you just can't be tempted right now. And later, as you gain control over your food addiction, all of these steps will become easier. Exercise regularly. The benefit to regular exercise is threefold. Many studies show us that exercise, especially high-intensity interval training, which we've talked about in some of our other webinars, and weight training, which are both extremely beneficial on their own, also have an impact on helping to control our appetite. Exercise also releases endorphins, similar to those released when you satisfy one of your cravings. So if you're already being pumped with those chemicals that make you feel good from the exercise, you'll be less likely to need the boost from the foods that you crave. When we exercise, we not only feel good, but we feel accomplished. As you try to change your behavior with food, when you exercise, you may feel that a sense of pride and accomplishment, and you don't want to diminish that or cancel it out by reverting back to that junk food and eating out all your hard work. Chemically, it'll be easier to control cravings, but also mentally, you may find that you're a little more driven and you don't want to undo all the hard work that you've just put in.
Don't give in to cravings. I know this sounds like a simple one, but there's science behind it. The more that you resist the craving, the easier it becomes the next time. Conversely, if you constantly reward the craving with the food that you crave, it becomes more and more difficult to gain control. So every time you let yourself have a cookie, you're rewarding that behavior. But each time that you forego the office birthday cake and make another day without having some kind of sweet during the afternoon, it's a small victory, and you should recognize that you're making some serious progress. Tap into your hunger. Learn what your hunger actually feels like. In today's world, like Shelby said, it's rare that we are more than 2 minutes away from a food source and barely ever have to actually feel hunger. Try to learn the difference between hunger and cravings. I like to use the carrot test. If you feel like you're hungry, but a plain carrot doesn't sound appealing, then you're probably not hungry, you're bored. And knowing that it's not an actual need for food and that your body is just craving something might make it easier to forego that craving. Eat whole foods. You've been on our webinars in the past, and if you're on our webinars in the future, this is a message that we're constantly reiterating to you. Stop abusing your taste buds with over-processed, hyper-palatable foods. As you begin to cut out those things that are typical of food addiction, like the sugary sweets and processed carbohydrates, you'll begin to realize just how good an apple or a parsnip can taste. This is really important. The whole foods will fill you up and help you maintain stable blood sugar levels as well as a healthy weight. But stable blood sugar means that you're going to have less cravings, and your body isn't going to send you out of whack signals for cravings that it doesn't really need. Focus your meals on proteins, whole proteins like meats, fish, eggs, and vegetables and fruits. And this will keep you satisfied, because when we get overly hungry, if we don't have access to these whole foods, it's really hard to control a craving. Making sure that you're getting enough protein and fiber from the whole foods is going to help not only control those cravings, but probably help diminish them in the long run. Get adequate sleep. Our hunger hormones are regulated very much by our sleep patterns. You may have noticed this in yourself already, that when you wake up early after a restless night, you feel like you're tired, you're low on energy, and you could eat everything in sight without getting full. And it isn't just because you're tired, and it isn't just because you're cranky. It's because your hormones are completely out of whack. Both the hunger hormone and the hormone that tells your body it's had enough food are imbalanced. So not only will you have to eat more to get full, but you'll constantly feel like you need to eat. If you ensure that you're meeting your individual sleep needs every night, you can help control these cravings and eventually break this food addiction cycle. Lastly, controlling your stress is so important. We know stress does crazy things to our bodies. It's just as important as our sleep, our exercise, and our eating habits. And it actually can affect how your body digests food. So just imagine how much damage junk foods do when we're stressed. Not only do you tend to be more likely to reach for those comfort foods to help you feel better about a situation or even just distract you from something that you're worried about, but then those foods don't even move through your body the way they should. Instead, take time to meditate, take a walk, watch a funny YouTube clip. Just detach from whatever the stressor is in your life to make this transition easier as you work through your food addiction. Additionally, if you feel like some of these steps are just too much to take on your own, there are various groups available to help you. These don't have to be, you don't have to be extremely food addicted. It doesn't have to be something that is consuming your entire life. But if you feel like it's affecting even just a few minutes of your day-to-day life, I think it's valuable to start taking these actionable steps. But then if that isn't enough for you, seek help in some of these additional resources. We'll have these up on our blog for you to find the resources available in your area. But I really do think that if you need to take advantage of these groups, they're out there. As always, we're looking for your feedback. If there are topics that you'd like to hear about or you have further questions about food addiction or just general webinar questions, you can email us at healthcoach@healthcheck360.com. Like I said, we'll have some resources up for you on our blog, as well as the recording of this webinar and our past webinars at healthcheck360blog.com. You can check us out on Twitter. You can like us on Facebook. We'd love to hear from you, so please keep in touch.